Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our November regular school board meeting. At this time, could we stand? No, we call the roll. Mr. Bassler. Sorry.
Mr. Jewell.
Present.
Mrs. McIntosh.
Here.
Mrs. Miller.
Here.
Mrs. Milligan.
Here.
Mrs. Morris.
Here.
Let's stand for the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Vell for the student program recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Jewell. We've got a double header tonight. The first up is Gail French, our Nutrition Services Director, to give us our annual report.
Yes, so I'm here to present the Food Service Consolidation Report for 2022-23 school year, and it's stating that we do follow the USDA guidelines and all the things that we do in our kitchen. I also want to share with you that we have an amazing staff in that kitchen. They all just really work together. They love those children, and they care about them beyond measure. They're just amazing. I also brought my new secretary. We hired her this summer, Molly Henson, would you stand, which some of you probably already know. She has really stepped up. She was a long-term manager, and she has stepped up and is doing a great job for us in the kitchen.
They do a great job. We have to turn this report into ODE every year, so Gail sends it to me. You guys, we present it to you, and then I can send it on its merry way with the report. Like she said, they got a great crew down there. They've done a great job. They haven't missed a beat from transitioning to a new building, COVID, everything else, and going from free meals to charging. They're keeping up with everything and doing everything up. It's one of the few food services that I've been in all my career, in all my buildings I've been in, that have been in the black. Most of the time the food service is in the red and they've got to get money from the general fund, but we have not had to do that as far as I know, as long as Gail's been here. So we appreciate all that they do and all the work that they put in. Thank you, Gail and Molly. Next we have John Augustine, the Athletic Director.
Good evening. For the fall athletics, now that we're complete, we're 3 weeks out, just wanted to mention, recognize a few things that we accomplished in the fall this year. Some improvements, volleyball improving, both with record, but also 2 sectional wins for the first time in 20 plus years. Girls golf, the 3rd district appearance, 2nd in the conference this year. And it's officially a conference sport going into next year. Boys golf, district participant again, 2nd in conference with the same record as first place, Brookville. And football playoffs, 30 in a row, just gradual improvements. I also wanted to recognize our first team All-League recipients and our Coach of the Year for boys golf. You would come on up here. Jonathan Ricketts, first team for football. You stand right over here. Yeah, right there. Emma Smith, first team for soccer. Noah Rutherford, first golf. Elsie Dobbins, first team girls golf. And then we've got 2 students that aren't here, weren't able to make it, Lexi Wells and Micah Powell. And then we have a Coach of the Year for boys golf, Kevin Witt. Come on up. Yeah. Of course he's Coach of the Year.
I voted for myself.
Come on up here. Go on down there.
All right.
And yeah, Kevin's going to go ahead and speak now. We're successful when we improve, when we grow. We're successful when we represent different sports, and I consider this a great success. So congratulations Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arden. It was a very wonderful fall campaign for all of our athletes and teams, and looking forward to another exciting winter season coming up shortly before we know it here. Girls have already started off well, and everybody else is working hard to be there. So thank you.
Anybody wants to leave now, the kids.
I don't know, they should probably stay, I just think. No, I'm kidding. You guys can take off if you want to. You don't need to stay unless you have to do it for a government project.
You're welcome to stay, but
I know Noah was begging to stay earlier. Thanks again, guys. Thanks for being here.
at this time, we set aside for visitor comments. If we have any visitors that wants to be recognized and make comments, come to the microphone, state your name, and
Good evening. My name is Jason Faulkner, 418 Deer Path Drive. At the end of September, I was appointed to a vacant seat on Carlisle City Council, and I was wanting to take this opportunity to come and extend my greetings and introduce myself to the board. I think I met one of you at the last football game, but would welcome the opportunity to get a chance to meet the rest of you. And I'm a big proponent of good schools make good communities. So I also want to thank Mrs. Lee. She actually gave me a quick tour because I had not had the opportunity to begin the building. I've only lived here since 2019. So if I can be of service to you, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. But thank you.
anyone else? At this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Basser for our treasurer report.
Definitely not Dr. Bass.
No, I know
that. I have a couple non-action items to cover before we get started on our action items. First thing is the December board meeting date. When we put together the board meeting dates almost an entire year ago, we kind of have to take a stab at some of the dates, especially without calendars being made. So the original board meeting date for December was December the 19th, which, as it turns out, once we get our school calendar done after the fact, that's during break. So what I wanted to discuss with the board, or just talk about the board, was moving that board meeting up till December the 12th instead of doing it on December the 19th.
Sounds good to me.
I'm fine with that.
Does anybody have a problem with moving the date? So we'll make an announcement. We'll make sure that we get it on the website. But those of you that do come to the meetings, the next meeting will be December the 12th. Same time, same place, right here, 6 o'clock for our regularly scheduled December board meetings. So just 2 weeks in between board meeting dates at this time. The second thing I want to talk to you about is our emergency levy, renewal of that levy. For those board members that remember, and for those of you from the community that remember, back in 2012, actually 2011, we had a combination ballot of the school and an income tax, which did not pass. We tried again in the spring of 2012, and it did not pass again. So the decision was made by the board at that time and the administration to drop off the new school portion of that and just do an operating levy, because we really needed operating funds. That was on the ballot in the fall of 2012, and that failed. So we put it on the ballot again in May of 2013, which was a 5-year emergency property tax, which collects in the neighborhood of about $1 million. Just a little bit under $1 million is what that generates. Fortunately for us as a district, that passed in May of 2013. It's a 5-year levy. So it was on the ballot again in May of 2018 as a renewal, and it passed. So it's 5 years later. This May will be May of 2023. So if we want to continue with that, collections of that particular levy, we'll have to put it on the ballot in May. Timeline-wise, if we decide to do that, is the December board meeting. We will pass a resolution of necessity. Then that goes on to the county auditor. They verify all the millage and stuff. And then in the January board meeting, we'd pass a resolution to proceed. And then I would file it with the Board of Elections, and it has to be filed somewhere in the first week of February. It has to be filed if the Board of Elections to be on the May ballot. So I just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of history of that, as well as that December meeting, we will be looking at the resolution of necessity to be passed. I don't have the specific millage right now, but I have a pretty good ballpark. When we ran that 10 years ago, the millage on that was 5.9. In a conversation with our county auditor, it looks like it's going to be in the neighborhood of 4.6 when it gets certified this time. I can't give that exact at this point and would hate to do that, but somewhere in that neighborhood. So when property values in Carlisle increase, we cannot collect any more than the just under $1 million on this. So it gets spread out a little bit more. So although your property goes up, so does everybody else's, and the pieces of the pie get greater. So when this is decided and when we get it on a ballot, again, it's not a new tax. It's strictly a renewal of what we did basically 10 years ago, and it's been renewed once in between then. So in order to keep everything as is, and I hope we don't have to do this, but we would have 2 shots of passing it in 2023. The May ballot, if things were to go sour, then we would have the opportunity again in November, just for the renewal. Again, I hope for a renewal we wouldn't have to do that, but yes, but for planning purposes, just to make sure everybody knows what the scenario is. Any questions from the board about that levy or renewal or anything? Okay, just wanted to make sure it was on your radar, and I'll have a resolution of necessity in a couple weeks for our next board meeting. All right, action items. First, I need an approval for the minutes from the last regularly scheduled board meeting, which was October 24th.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Miller.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Milligan. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan?
Yes.
Mrs. Morris?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
And Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
The next is the financial report. I won't talk too much about it because I will talk more about our financial status in the next item. So if you don't have any questions about the specific financial report for last month, I'll need an approval.
I need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Milligan.
Second.
Second by Mrs. McIntosh. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Milligan?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
And Mrs. Morris?
Yes.
All right. Next on my portion is twice a year, we have to file a 5-year forecast with the Ohio Department of Education. First of those being after school starts in the month of November, and then again in May as the school year ends. So this is our 5-year forecast, which is basically for fiscal year 2023 now, all the way out through 2027. And I think you guys know how I feel about a 5-year projection. Years 4 and 5 are a total crapshoot. I think it would be a much greater document if it was just a 3-year projection, but it is what it is, and it's a 5-year projection. So to kind of, that's part of your packet. Hopefully you've had a time to look it over. Where we stand financially, we stand in good shape right now financially. We have a healthy carryover. Based on our income tax collections, which have been good, based on the state funding that we have been receiving under the New Fair Funding Act, and based on us continuing to try to stay conservative on our expenses, we're projected to bring in more than what we're going to spend at the end of this year. And actually, it's about break even, but projected to bring in more than what we expect to spend next year after 2 years. Beginning in year 3, we would begin to spend more than what we bring in. Again, those are just projections. It's hard to tell. There's no crystal ball. The idea would be to continue to stay as conservative as we can in year 1 and year 2 of the forecast to make sure that years 3, 4, and 5 there's a lot more black numbers than there are red numbers. We are in a negotiations year this year, so we'll be negotiating with the teachers union probably not too long after we get back from Christmas break. So that's one of the big things expense-wise. Secondly, will be benefits. 2 years ago, we took a really hard hit on benefits, but the last year or so, the benefits have kind of leveled out. So we'll see where that takes us. But overall, 10 years ago when we passed this levy, we said that this would make us fiscally sound for at least 5 years when we passed this levy 10 years ago. That made it 5 years, and then we've made it almost 10 years once we passed that emergency levy. If you look at the forecast, we're actually in the black through 5 more years. So I think we've been really fiscally responsible with the money that we've asked for our taxpayers. So I'm hoping, planning to continue to do the same as we move forward. Does anybody have any specific questions about anything on the forecast?
I know. I do this at least once a year. Where do we stand on the property of the old Hutchison plant now?
The old DP&L property, we're basically not collecting very much with that anymore. However, I did read an article in the Dayton Daily News, I don't know, it was about 6 months ago, that there is some talk of making that riverfront property.
That would help us.
That would help us tremendously. But if you drive by on a daily basis, it's a pretty slow process.
Yeah. Maybe they've got a casino up there.
they've got a lot to take down and then a lot more to put up. But somewhere, somebody has a plan to make that riverfront property with restaurants and shopping. Will that ever come to fruition? I think
we're at a point now where we don't really collect.
We don't really collect a whole lot because there's not much value to that property right now.
Okay. Anybody else?
If there's no other specific questions about the forecast, I've talked more this time than I have typically in 6 meetings, so I'll go ahead and ask for approval.
Who was that from? First by Mrs. Morris.
Second.
Second by Mrs. McIntosh. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Morris?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
And then finally, we need to approve a donation from the Carlisle Soccer Association, which went to our athletic department.
First by Mrs. Milligan.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Miller. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Milligan?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
And Mrs. Morris?
Yes.
Thank you. That's my report for the month.
At this time, we will turn it over to Dr. Bell for the superintendent's report.
Thank you, Mr. Jewell. My non-action items, first thing I was going to do was introduce Mr. Faulkner, but he took that away from me, so I'm 1/3 of the way done. If you've driven out in the back of the building, you'll maybe notice that the home side bleachers are now gone. So we'll be moving forward with that, getting that concrete pad, getting the new bleachers, and looking at the press box. So things are moving forward over there. The other thing, district update, over break, a lot of people in here cleaning, doing a lot of stuff, spraying, trying to keep the viruses and bugs and germs and fighting those things. And thank Jimmy and his crew. They did a lot of man hours, and appreciate that. So we'll see how effective it was, depending on our attendance right here the next 3 weeks. The other thing is, I gave you a picture. That picture is a picture of a bench that the Lions Club has donated to us. It was created from plastic. To make that bench, she's been, Brenda Abney from the Lions Club has been working with Patrick Flanagan. They're trying to put him over there by the, on Fairview Road from the corner to the tennis courts. Their goal is to add a couple of benches along that area, so we certainly appreciate their helping that area over there for us. Then the other item I had, we already did with Mrs. French with the compliance with nutritional standards report. If you have any questions on that, it was basically a rundown of what we do to say that we do what we're supposed to do according to the Ohio Revised Code and according to ODE as far as what we prepare and serve for lunches. Okay.
Before he moves on, I want to clarify a little bit more about the bleacher project that's going on in the back, because I know I'm going to get several questions, and I've already had questions already today on how that's being funded, and have we raised that much money already in our capital improvement project and all that stuff. So again, a little bit of history. We can go back to 2017 when we passed the bond issue for this building. Not too long after that, we sold bonds, which were in the amount of $20 million. So the state contributed $29.5 million, and we sold bonds, which is what everybody's we're paying back as a community, bonds for $20 million. At that time, the building plans weren't done. We were still in the process of putting everything together, and everybody remembers the time, like, what is the school doing? We passed this like a year ago. How come nobody's got a shovel out here and done anything? Well, during that time and all the way up until we started paying bills on the building, that money, that $20 million was invested. And it was drawing interest. And when we finish up with the project, which I just filed my very last financial detail report for the project 5 years later from the time that we passed it, any interest dollars that are left in that project that did not have to go into the building can be used for other capital projects. So that is where we were hopefully using foresight to be able to put together some interest earnings to be able to do some other things on our campus once the building was complete, to try to get some of our other facilities up to being as nice as what this brand new building is. So if that question comes up, that's where that money is coming from for the home bleachers and the press box and the project that's being done out there. We are also part of a capital campaign to raise money to do many, many other things, which I don't want to go into, but hopefully we'll be able to do other very nice things to all of our outdoor athletic facilities for all of our children here at Carlisle. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that and make sure everybody knows where that's coming from at this point. Again, probably too much of a history lesson, but to me, that's the best way to explain it. Sorry, Dr. Bell.
Thanks, Mr. Master. He told me not to talk money, so I didn't. I just didn't know he was going to talk that much about it, so there you go. So put the time clock on him. Thank you. I've got some action items here. First of all, classified resignation. I'd like for you to approve the resignation of Seth Powell as the head bus mechanic effective 10/31/22.
First by Mrs. Milligan. Second by Mrs. Morris. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Milligan? Yes. Mrs. Morris? Yes. Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller.
Yes.
Thank you. Item 2, classified employment. A, approve Jim Ball as head bus mechanic effective 11/14/2022, and approve Grant Cheney as sub-custodian effective 11/11/2022.
Need a motion? First by Mrs. Milligan,
Second.
second by Mrs. Miller. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Milligan?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Mrs. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Thank you. Last item I have is supplemental employment. Item A, approve Jordan McKnight as volunteer junior high wrestling assistant coach, and B, approve Caden Langdon as volunteer junior high school wrestling assistant coach.
First by Mrs. McIntosh, second by Mrs. Milligan. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Mrs. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's all the items that I have tonight.
Anything from the legislation report?
There's nothing to report.
Do we have any old business? On new business, did you want to say anything, Mrs. Steckel, about your campaign? Okay.
I have one thing. I just want to wish Ross Campbell good luck. He is leaving tomorrow to go compete on Wheel of Fortune Teen Edition, and he is such an awesome representation of Carlisle. He's going to do amazingly well. So I just want to give him a little good luck shout out.
If that be all, I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Milligan, second by Mrs. McIntosh. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Milligan?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mrs. Morris?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Time is 6:27.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.